my biggest regret and my biggest apology is that we didn't do outing earlier and target more homophobes and hypocrites.
Okay.
That would have changed the whole framework of the debate much sooner and got law reform much faster.
Hi, Peter.
Great to join you.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on. For those who have seen the documentary, Hating Peter Tatchell on Netflix now, you'll hopefully have a really good appreciation of Peter's life at this stage and his sort of campaigning exploits over the years. For those who haven't seen it, go and watch it as soon as you've listened to this. You definitely won't regret it. It's a really, really interesting hour and a bit on Peter's life, especially if you've got a kind of campaigning energy as Peter does. You'll get a real insight into what it takes to sort of sacrifice for the greater good. I think Peter embodies that in huge amounts. So Peter, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So I want to start with the beginning where the documentary starts, which is kind of the chronology of your life, and we go into the campaigning. So you were born in Melbourne. You lived there for the first 18 years or so of your life. And when you were at school, you showed an early sort of campaigning zeal where you took on the establishment. You were voted head boy, despite being known as kind of a radical left winger and also by some boys as gay. How did you end up becoming head boy with that sort of baggage, as it were? And talk to me a little bit about how you took on this on the school at the time.
Well, pretty much from the get-go, when I went to high school, I questioned everything. I didn't take anything for granted, including some aspects of the way in which the school was run. So together with others, we championed the idea of a students' representative council, whereby every form would elect a pupil who would join this council and would make decisions and recommendations to the headmaster and to the staff. And we secured a lot of successes. You know, we changed, for example, the food in the tuck shop, you know, in the school canteen. We got much better food. We organized planting trees around the school grounds as part of a commitment to, you know, the environment. This is way back in early 1960s as well. So as a result of that work, you know, when it came to deciding who the prefects of the school should be, traditionally it had been done by or chosen by the staff and the headmaster. But we decided that living in a democracy, just as, you know, people elect members of parliament, our head boy and head girl, and indeed all the prefects, should be elected by a vote of the pupils. So as a result of my work, you know, defending the right of students, in 1968, I was elected as the male school captain by a vote of all the boys in the school, which amounted to about 500 boys.
Which I guess is a really impressive thing with the kind of, like I said earlier, the kind of the left-wing baggage and the fact that you were discussed as being gay, which at the time in the documentary you say you wouldn't have called yourself that, you didn't know you were that at the time, which was quite an achievement. But it seems to me when I listen back and I compare myself to you at that kind of age, which talking like 16, are we talking 16, 17 at this age?
16.
Yeah, I was quite rebellious at school, but I didn't take that next step to being a kind of a campaigner, really. I guess mine was kind of a juvenile, teenage, rebellious sort of vibe, whereas you seemed quite grown up. You were making the case for Aboriginal people in Australia. You were taking the step from actually moaning or talking about something to actually acting on something. So you were quite a grown-up teenager, were you?
Well, others will be the judge of that, but you're right. I mean, together with other pupils, I heard about the fact that young Indigenous Aboriginal Australians were leaving school at the minimum age because their parents needed them to work and earn an income. And I thought this was a terrible shame, because education is the key to the upliftment of any community.
Yeah.
So we came up with the idea of fundraising to finance scholarships, which would pay for Indigenous Aboriginal kids to stay on at school.
Yeah.
so they could get qualifications, which would not only ensure that they had a decent job and income, but would also hopefully help uplift their communities as well.
Yeah.
And I can remember being denounced by the headmaster as being manipulated by the communists. I very robustly defended us, saying, we were supporting Aboriginal Indigenous rights, and education, and he as a head should understand the importance of education, and that had nothing whatsoever to do with communism.
No, it's interesting that even back then, things don't change today. Like you throw out the lazy kind of trope of, oh, if you're trying to do something that's sort of socially conscious, you're a communist or you're a Marxist or something. It's the same lazy stuff you hear in the Express and the Sun all the time today. It's strange, isn't it, how these things just always seem to work. But so my next question is about how you as a gay man, you refused or you were reluctant to come out to your parents early on, back in Australia. Talk to me about why this was the case and what the situation was like for gay men and women in Australia and the UK at this time.
Well, back in my home state of Victoria, where Melbourne is the capital, in the late 1960s, and indeed until 1981, homosexuality was a very serious criminal offence. You could be jailed for several years and even forced to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment on the grounds that you were sick.
Right.
So that was a pretty scary atmosphere. Plus, there was very widespread queer bashing violence and harassment, and even violence by the police as well. There were no gay organizations back then, not even any helplines or switchboards.
Right.
Absolutely nothing. So for me to realize I was gay was a big step. But as soon as I had my first same-sex experience, I was totally comfortable with it, which is quite amazing given my very intense and quite fundamentalist Christian upbringing, where homosexuality was seen as a major sin.
Yeah.
But I just thought, well, I'm not harming anybody. I love this man. The sex is great. We care for each other. No one has been harmed. There's been nothing that hasn't been consensual. So what's the fuss about?
Yeah.
And that motivated me in 1969 to begin my one-person campaigning for LGBT plus rights, because in the absence of any LGBT plus organizations back then, one-person campaigning was all that I could do.
So you were so compelled even at that stage that you were like, I'm just going to go out there and just, I mean, were you concerned about getting a criminal record? Were you concerned about being forcibly enrolled in psychiatric treatment? Were you concerned your parents might grash you into the authorities? I mean, were you anxious about all of this stuff, or were you just throwing yourself in and not really listening to too much what was going on around you? I mean, how are you feeling at this time?
No, I was very anxious and even quite afraid. When I wrote letters to newspapers criticizing homophobic press reporting or making the case for the decriminalization of homosexuality, initially I didn't dare sign my name or give my address, because I feared a policeman's knock on the door. It took me several months before I summoned up the courage to give my name and address. But even then, I was nervous. I still thought that maybe the newspaper might turn over my details to the police, and that I could get charged with a homosexual offence and end up in prison.
Was there ever a moment in your mind where you just decided, I'm gonna be almost like a martyr? I'm gonna sacrifice my safety, my freedom, my liberty? Was there a moment where you crossed that threshold? Because I think for a lot of people, I mean, I'm really concerned about the climate emergency, but I refuse to get arrested for Extinction Rebellion because I'm a school teacher and I can't have a criminal record, and I've got a lot to sort of lose, as it were, if I cross that threshold. Even though I'm terrified of it, I'm still, as a campaigner, I still try to remain on the lawful side of stuff. Was there a moment where you went from being a lawful mindset to being a kind of like, I'm going to cross this threshold and become a kind of work in the kind of anti-law area? Can you remember a moment, or was there no moment?
Well, first of all, I've never wanted to be a martyr.
No, okay.
Martyrs end up dead.
Oh, yeah.
But, very early on, I decided that some things were so wrong that they needed to be challenged, even if it meant peacefully and non-violently breaking the law.
Okay.
So at the time, in the late 1960s, Australia was fighting alongside America in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. I studied that war and realized that it was very unjust, that American and Australian forces were committing war crimes against the people of Vietnam. And that was wrong. And therefore, I wasn't prepared to sign up for the draft for Vietnam. Mm. And moreover, I was involved in the campaign to encourage other young men to refuse the draft. And that was a criminal offense, punishable by up to 2 years in prison if you encouraged men to not sign up and register for the draft.
Yeah.
But I did that because I felt this war was so wrong, so unjust, so immoral.
That's really interesting, because you've already gone from talking about Aborigines, Aboriginal people in Australia, already gay rights, and now the Vietnam War. So you're already campaigning it on lots of kind of different fronts. So it seems to me, and I think I have a little bit of this as well, is you see an injustice and you can't help but want to go and do something about it. I mean, is that nature, nurture? I mean, how do you explain this? Is it part of your character instinctively, or is it something that being around certain people brings you in? I mean, how can you explain that? Because not many people are like that.
Well, I don't quite know how and why, but I can tell you this. My parents were very devout evangelical Pentecostal Christians, pretty much borderline fundamentalist.
Yeah.
And they had a very strict, devout attitude towards life. But the one thing they did teach me, which I think probably stood in good stead, was that we all have a personal responsibility for what we do or what others do in our name. So they taught me to stand up for what is right. Don't follow the crowd. Don't go along with the consensus. Think for yourself and follow your conscience. Do what is right. Now, of course, they meant that primarily in a religious sense, but I interpret it much more broadly. So, when Australia was fighting in Vietnam, I thought for myself. I did the research. I realized the war was wrong, and that prompted me to campaign against it and against the draft as well. Now, I suppose you could also say that I drew on some of the more liberal aspects of Christian teaching. So, love thy neighbor as thyself. I am my brother and sister's keeper. Be a good Samaritan. I suppose those kinds of Christian values have stayed with me. Of course, they're not exclusively Christian, but no, that's how I came across them.
Yeah. So solidarity, being on the right side of history, sticking up for the little man, thinking for yourself. I mean, you're a member of the Humanist UK, aren't you? And these are very much humanist values as well, aren't they? I mean, let's be honest, think for yourself, act for everyone, I think is the kind of the humanist motto. And I see that in you in great detail. I want to move on because we've got a lot to talk about. So talk to me about the Gay Liberation Front. So this is an organization that spanned both America and the UK. You were part of the UK version of the Gay Liberation Front. Talk to me about who they were, why they were set up, and what your role in this organization was.
Well, the London Gay Liberation Front was really a watershed moment in British LGBT plus history. For the first time, not dozens, hundreds, but thousands of LGBT plus people came out and protested in the streets to demand our liberation. This had never happened before. And we were making demands that went way beyond the decriminalization that had taken place in part, it was only a very limited decriminalisation, in 1967 in England and Wales. We were talking about the media misrepresentation and demonisation of LGBT plus people. We were challenging the laws that allowed landlords and employers to discriminate against LGBT plus people. We were taking on the church and other religious institutions over their homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And really, none of these things had happened before. And we were very proud and defiant. We weren't apologetic. We weren't defensive. We weren't pleading for our rights. We were demanding them. And the Gay Liberation Front did not succeed in changing any law, despite our efforts, because society was so homophobic at the time, and Parliament, the government, and MPs were so homophobic, it was impossible. But what we did was change LGBT plus consciousness from victims to victors, to end that internalized shame and self-hatred, to be proud of who we were, to demand victory in our struggle for LGBT plus liberation. And we also, of course, changed wider public consciousness, organizing the first gay pride parade in Britain in 1972 in London. That was a real watershed moment, because we were there on the streets, visible, proclaiming our space, our right to public space, our right to equality and non-discrimination. And that began to shift public consciousness. So the gains were really transforming the LGBT plus mindset and also changing public consciousness. Those are the two really big gains and successes of the Gay Liberation Front.
Yeah, I think when I was reading about the Stonewall riots, what was the Gay Liberation Front in the UK kind of spawned from the Stonewall riots that happened in America a few years before? Is that kind of the transition? Is that how it happened?
Well, not quite. What happened was, in the wake of the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, the Gay Liberation Front was established in New York.
Yeah.
Couple of months or so later.
Yeah.
Then people in Britain heard about this, and two students, Aubrey Walter and Bob Mellors, went to the United States, met with Gay Liberation Front activists, and then brought those ideas back to Britain. And they called the first meeting at London School of Economics, which led to the formation of the London Gay Liberation Front.
And were you there at the very beginning then?
No, I wasn't. No, I came several months later.
I was still,
I was still in Australia at the time.
Okay. But you were there at the beginning-ish, you didn't come along years later, you were there.
No. I joined, the Gay Liberation Front was set up in London in late 1970, and I joined in the summer of 1971. Okay,
cool. One of the things I was reading about was that the Gay Liberation Front in America, it was anti-capitalist, pro-Black Panther Party. It attacked the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. What was the decision behind it to have this kind of left-wing identity? Was it just that they wanted to be completely anti-establishment across the board? Was that the wisest thing? Because I know that the Black Lives Matter organization now gets attacked by the right for the same kind of, it's Marxist, it's anti-capitalist, blah, blah. Does that not just open up another attack route for its enemies to say, look, they're anti-capitalist, look, they support this movement over here, which we don't like as well? Or could it have been a bit more focused and just left all the kind of the rest of the politics aside? Was that core to its identity? Did it have to be kind of left-wing in that sense?
Well, we didn't really see it so much as left-wing as human rights and liberation for all.
Okay.
We very much recognize that we as LGBT plus people experience a particular and acute form of discrimination, even persecution. But we also recognize that so did other communities. So the London Gay Liberation Front aligned with the women's liberation movement, the Black liberation movement,
right, okay,
the Irish liberation movement,
right,
and the struggles of working class people and trade unions.
yeah,
We saw our different social movements having an interest in working together and supporting each other.
yeah. Courage speaks to courage everywhere. That kind
sorry?
of courage speaks to courage everywhere. That kind of suffragette motto.
Absolutely. And we thought that if we helped these other movements and stood in solidarity with them, then they would reciprocate with us.
And did they?
In often cases they did.
Yeah.
Not always, because the climate was very homophobic, and some of these other social movements imbibed that homophobia.
Yeah.
But regardless, we felt we should do the right thing. And so, for example, we went on the Troops Out of Ireland marches. Some of our members in the London Gay Liberation Front were Irish or of Irish descent, and all of us objected to the way in which the British Army was engaged in Northern Ireland and had been involved in multiple human rights abuses, particularly the massacre of 14 innocent unarmed civilians in Derry in 1972. And we even though many in the Irish community were very homophobic, we thought, regardless, we will stand up for what is right. Mm-hmm. And what the British Army is doing in Northern Ireland is wrong. So we took a stand. The other thing that's distinctive about the Gay Liberation Front was that the word equality never passed our lips. We were into liberation. We did not want to be equal with straight people in a fundamentally flawed and unjust society. We recognized that what was required was a social transformation. Mm-hmm. And the reason we said that was because, straight people often had a bad deal. Take sex and relationship education in schools, which the Gay Liberation Front championed. It wasn't very good back then. In fact, it was very bad back then for straight kids. Mm. So we didn't want equally bad sex and relationship education for LGBT pupils. Yeah. We wanted better sex and relationship education for all young people.
Yeah.
So that's typical of the way in which we had a bigger, broader, wider agenda, more than just equal rights.
So
another facet of the London Gay Liberation Front was that we recognized what is now called intersectionality. Now, we were doing this 5 decades ago. We recognize we aren't just gay, we are male or female or intersex or trans, bisexual. We are black and white. We are rich and poor, young and old. Some live in London, some live in other parts of the country. So we recognize that, people don't just have one identity, they have multiple identities. Mm-hmm. And, it's no good winning just LGBT plus rights for a disabled person if the law discriminates or the law makes it hard for them to get benefits. We want to change the laws to enable disabled people to have better rights, full stop, whether you're gay, straight, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that someone was out there to change the norms of society and not just, like you say, gain equality and fit into a flawed system. So thanks, Peter. I'm just going to say thanks so much for being part of that struggle, because that was a much more ambitious struggle, wasn't it? I suppose you could have just, done the easier thing and just said, please let us be equal with you guys, and we would have carried on living in a deeply flawed society. But you went the next step and tried to change society for the better, and I think you have. I mean, as a school teacher, when I speak to the sort of lads now who I imagine 30, 40 years ago would have been extremely homophobic, there is immense solidarity now among the kind of like laddie lads, at school with LGBT plus students. There is virtually no sort of ardent homophobia. There's kind of more soft homophobia with the use of the word gay and stuff, that sort of stuff. But to be honest, there is and a real consciousness around it now, and actual education and understanding about these things. So for me, Gen Z are quite impressive on this front. As a school teacher, it does make me quite proud when I reflect on where we are with those guys, and that's massively down to your work as well. I want to move on again. So the World Youth Festival, 1973, you went out there. This is East Berlin, so communist side of the Iron Curtain at this stage. Tell me about what you did here, because you went out there and you caused a bit of a fuss. What did you do? What happened?
Well, I heard that this World Festival of Youth and Students was going to take place in communist East Berlin in 1973, where upwards of 140,000 students and young people from all over the world would go. I thought this is a fantastic opportunity to spread the ideas of LGBT plus liberation, particularly to those coming from countries that were ruled by communist regimes, which were mostly universally very, very homophobic. So I managed to get myself accredited as a member of the British delegation and went there and staged a series of protests. I planned to lay a pink triangle wreath at Sachsenhausen concentration camp in memory of the gay and bisexual men who were interned there and often murdered there. But that was vetoed by the East German authorities, who said the people will not understand it. So as a compensation, I was given the right to speak at a youth rights conference. But as soon as I began speaking about LGBT plus liberation, all the microphones went dead. And this was to a packed audience of maybe 500 or 1,000 young people, right, from all different countries. Yeah. They asked me to leave the podium. They said, your speech is over now, please leave. I refused. The audience saw this spark of rebellion, and many of them were coming from communist countries, had never ever seen it before. And they started jeering and slow hand clapping in support of my right to speak. So eventually I was allowed to speak, and I got the message out, as I say, to maybe several hundred or more young people from different countries, including communist ones. On another occasion, I handed out leaflets about gay liberation that I had smuggled into East Germany, and got arrested by, well, I think that there were a combination of police and secret police who confiscated them and tried to arrest me. But there were some other members of the British delegation there, and I was the subject of a tug of war between the East Germans and the British delegates. Wow. And eventually, with press people around and photographers, these Germans decided the better of it to avoid bad publicity, and they let me go. Yeah.
So without the media there, that could have ended quite differently.
It could have, yes. Yeah. And on the final day of the festival, every organization attending was asked to make placards or banners representing their cause and their organization. So I made one in support of gay liberation, on one side in English and on the reverse side in German. I was eating a meal at a restaurant when I was approached by members of the Stasi, the secret police, who told me I would not be allowed to march with that placard. Someone had apparently tipped them off that I'd made the placard back at the British delegation's headquarters. Oh, right. So I wasn't going to take that. So I jumped over tables and scarpered out the back door of the restaurant, ran into the crowd, and sort of crawled across the open plaza on my hands and knees so they couldn't see me among the crowd, and then eventually popped up among the British delegation. But some of them were very homophobic, and they physically violently attacked me. I was punched and kicked and spat at. Wow! They ripped the placard, and in the end, I had to be spirited away by some very brave young communists in East Germany, gay young communists, who were shadowing me throughout to make sure I wasn't harmed. Right. They'd witnessed what had happened, and they spirited me away to a secret hiding place. And then I waited a few hours and got my bags, and then I went back to East Berlin. Amazingly, I was allowed through the checkpoint. as I was going through, I was shaking with nerves, thinking I was going to get arrested and end up in prison for many years. But no, it didn't happen.
Wow. I mean, some might say that was quite a reckless decision to defy the Stasi. I mean, they had quite a bad reputation, the Stasi, as well. I mean, they weren't people that you would necessarily and take on without so you decided to just, was it a sort of, in the moment, was it a kind of rush of blood, or were you just so determined to get this message out there? What was it? Was it just that sense of solidarity and wanting to help other people? Or, I mean, how can you explain that decision? Because I think it takes an incredibly brave person to do something like that, doesn't it?
Well, it was a sense of solidarity and sort of duty. I knew that gay liberation ideas were not known about at all in the communist bloc of countries.
Okay.
Russia, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw this as absolutely something imperative that I needed to do to stand in solidarity with LGBT plus people in those countries. And I knew there were risks, but I calculated that during the festival, there would be media there, and that the East German authorities probably would not want bad publicity. Plus, of course, I had the protection, sort of having a foreign Western passport.
Yeah.
And that gave me some protection. So it was a big gamble. It could have ended up very differently and quite ugly. People said at the time, I could have ended up serving several years in an East German prison. But luckily, it didn't happen.
No. I mean, bravo and well, and I mean, I think your courage is just really moving. Actually, when I was watching the documentary, and I know it's kind of a documentary that's supposed to bring you in a motive, supposed to elicit that emotive response. But I mean, as a sort of like campaigner, but obviously not on the kind of as radical as you, it just kind of makes me it inspired me, actually, watching a documentary. I found it really inspirational. And we do need people to rock the boat, because you just get results by doing that. I mean, I was involved in the Brexit campaigning with the Remain community, and we didn't rock the boat, and we lost. And I feel like at times we probably did need some people to rock the boat, but we just didn't really have it in our community. One of the things we're probably missing.
Well, it's great that you got that from the film. I mean, one of the reasons why I collaborated with the filmmaker Christopher Amos was to show that social change is possible, and these are some tips or ideas on how you can do it. So I want to inspire a new generation of change makers and activists. And
I think you'll have done that. I think you'll have done that. And
also, I've got to say that I take my inspiration from others.
Of course, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, don't we?
Absolutely. And I've taken some risks, but nothing by comparison to the risks of human rights defenders in Russia, Zimbabwe, Saudi Arabia, or Uganda. They daily risk their lives and liberty. So if they could do that, then I can take a few risks as well.
Yeah, I actually have a question on that, so we'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to move on now to the Bermondsey by-election, because this is a really pivotal moment in your kind of, I guess, in your career, in your journey as a campaigner and stuff. So the Bermondsey by-election, what year was this? 1980, was it? 1983? 83, cool, yeah. Oh yeah, of course, I've got it written down right here. So by-election's cool. This was a safe Labour seat, Southeast London, and you're selected as the Labour candidate for the Bermondsey by-election. You're up against the Liberal or the Liberal SDP candidate at the time, whose name I've got written down here.
Simon Hughes.
Simon Hughes, who later became, or is now the Chancellor of the LSBU, and later became the deputy leader of the Lib Dems in the coalition. So became a big name in Parliament. You lost that by-election. Why did you lose that by-election? Tell me about what happened, and tell me about why you think you lost it, and tell me about the atmosphere during that by-election, because it's a very famous story, this, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, most commentators say that the Bermondsey by-election was probably the dirtiest, most violent, and definitely most homophobic election in Britain since 1945. And no other by-election has come near it, although of course Batley and Spen recently had echoes of it. In that election, I was up against 4 fascist candidates, and of course Simon Hughes, the Liberal Democrats, and John O'Grady, who was, quote, the real Labour candidate.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
I was pilloried in a very xenophobic campaign because I was born in Australia.
Right.
I was also vilified because of my left-wing policies and ideas, which were denounced as extremist. But I've got to tell you, the extremist ideas that I was condemned for are now the mainstream. I was arguing in favour of a national minimum wage. That's been the law for years.
Crazy.
I argued in favour of a Comprehensive Equality Act to protect everyone against discrimination. It happened in 2010. I argued for a negotiated political settlement in Northern Ireland to end the war there. It had happened with the Good Friday Agreement.
Yep.
So all my extremist ideas that I was absolutely vilified for are now the mainstream. And then, of course, I was also subjected to an incredible hate campaign because I was gay and supported LGBT plus rights. I think my proposals for LGBT plus rights set out in 1983 were at the time the most radical and comprehensive of any political candidate. Even then, or probably since. I went into incredible detail about every different aspect of anti-LGBT plus discrimination and proposed laws to change that. So yeah, I was hit by the triple whammy of xenophobia, anti-socialism, and homophobia.
And you touch a little bit, a tiny bit. I wish you'd gone into a little bit more detail. I guess you didn't have time on the role of the media. And you talk about how the kind of the drip, drip, drip. There wasn't a specific single headline or article. It was just the volume. So I mean, are we talking about the right wing papers? We're talking about Sun, Mail, Express, Telegraph. These are the sorts of outlets, or was it the BBC? Who can you name names? Can you say who were the kind of the worst people involved in this?
Yeah, it was mostly the tabloids like the Sun, Daily Star, News of the World,
of course,
Daily Mirror, Daily Mail. They were the main offenders. But see, I was selected as the Labour candidate in November 1981, and then there was a 15-month lead up to the by-election in February 1983, and throughout that entire time, there was a non-stop drip, drip, drip of negative, hostile, and sometimes even fabricated stories by the tabloid press. But even so, when the by-election was finally called in early 1983, opinion polls still put me on 47% support. The nearest rivals were about 18 or 20%. So I was way, way, way ahead. But in the weeks of the actual campaign, the media assaults became ever more extreme. And that's why in the end, in large part, I lost the election. Now, of course, some people may disagree with me. They may think, a person born in Australia is unfit to be an MP. They may think that a national minimum wage will cause the collapse of society. They may believe that homosexuality is a sin and queer people are perverts. But, whatever, I lost that election big time. And it was, the biggest election losses for Labour ever.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the role of the Liberal SDP literature that was put out, and I know that you got an apology later for one piece of literature, I think, that said something like they used the phrase "straight choice." Now, was this a kind of double entendre? Was this a kind of subtle homophobic dig at you? Were your opposition actually using negative tactics there, do you think?
Well, undoubtedly, leaflets for Simon Hughes and the Liberals described the election as a straight choice.
Yeah.
And many people interpreted that as a dig at me being gay and supporting LGBT plus rights.
Yeah.
Also, of course, male liberal canvassers went out on the doorsteps with stickers, lapel stickers with the words, "I've been kissed by Peter Tatchell." And lots of liberal... Sorry?
What were they trying to? I don't understand that. Why would? What was that trying to do?
Well, they were trying to draw attention to the fact that I was gay.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Right.
And equally, a lot of liberal canvassers would say things on the doorsteps like, oh, we don't care if Peter Tatchell's gay. We don't care if he supports gay rights. But of course, they did care very much. They were using that language to plant in the voters' minds that I was gay and supported gay rights.
Right.
Clearly to appeal to base emotions and homophobic electors.
Yeah.
And indeed, the evidence shows that a substantial part of the vote against me and for Simon Hughes was by people who had a hatred of gay people. Ironic, because Simon Hughes eventually came out many years later as being bisexual.
I saw this, yeah. Ironic. I used to live in Exeter, and we have Ben Bradshaw down there, the Labour MP, and I remember he came and did a talk for the students when I was studying there, and he spoke about how he got elected in 1997. So this was obviously way after your attempt to get elected, and even the campaign that he had to run against the Conservative and also against the former Labour MP before him was incredibly homophobic, and I think he was the first out MP or something from what I remember. But even
I think Stephen Twigg was in 1987. I think.
Okay. But I remember Ben basically saying that he had to go through a huge amount of homophobic anti-campaigning against him as well, even in 97. So it showed that they were still trying to use the same things, 10 years later or so. But so the next question I have, Ian McKellen says in the document, you've got some really good people in there, Stephen Fry, Ian McKellen, some wicked people. He says that, was it actually not better that you didn't win, because we would have probably lost one of our greatest sort of provocateurs if you'd have become a sort of member of the establishment? I mean, would Peter Tatchell be a same familiar name? Would we have still have changed the world in the same way if he'd have been a member of parliament? What do you think?
Well, of course, I wanted to be elected to parliament so that I could take my LGBT plus and other social justice and equality campaigns into parliament to get the law changed. That was my rationale. But had I been elected, I wouldn't have given up the protesting and campaigning outside of parliament.
Okay.
I'm very conscious that nearly every social reform starts outside of parliament, and that MPs are often the last people to get the message. So
often just jumping on public opinion at the last minute, really, isn't it?
Sometimes. Yeah, exactly. With the campaign to get women the right to vote, it was begun by the suffragettes outside of parliament. It took a long time before parliament finally, got the message, the penny dropped, and they legislated those changes. So if I had been elected, I would have most definitely continued the external campaigning as well. But as you say, many people have observed that perhaps I've been more effective as a ginger campaigner on the outside, shaking up the establishment, doing provocative confrontational things that got people thinking and talking.
Yeah.
Maybe that was more effective, but I couldn't have done as much of that if I'd been an elected member of parliament.
And it's hard to punch up if you're the up. Do you know what I mean? If you're the establishment, it's hard to be anti-establishment. Well, I say that. I mean, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage seem to get away with it these days. It's very, very bizarre how they can be anti-establishment figures, even though they are the epitome of the establishment. But the other thing I wanted to mention was the whole concept of the sort of the Overton window and shifting the Overton window. You have to have people who set far out and then shift what the norm is in the middle by being that far out. And I guess that's kind of what your role has been. You've been kind of the flanking wing of a lot of campaigns where we'll come to this in a second, because I'm conscious that we're going to run out of time otherwise. The difference between Stonewall and what became Outrage, and the kind of the differences between those two camps in a minute. But we'll come back. We'll circle back to that in a sec. So just briefly, the 1980s. I was born in 1990, so anything I know about the 1980s, I have to watch documentaries about Peter Tatchell and stuff. Which is obviously very educational, but I don't have the emotional connection to it. So talk to me about the 1980s. Talk to me about what it was like for the LGBTQI plus community at that stage, the AIDS pandemic, and We're going to come on to Section 28 and Margaret Thatcher as well, but just talk to me about the kind of the atmosphere and what it was like being a gay man in Britain in the 1980s.
Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the LGBT plus community was on a winning streak. Although we were not getting legislative changes, we were changing public hearts and minds, and we were changing the way in which institutions like the police and others treated us. Not by a long shot far enough, but we were moving down that road.
Yeah.
The advent of the Greater London Council, led by Ken Livingstone in 1980-81, and other Labour-run local authorities resulted in the first ever public funding for LGBT plus organizations. That was a real breakthrough. It also meant that local authorities were, for the first time, providing facilities like meeting rooms for LGBT plus groups. At that stage, public opinion was definitely moving towards greater acceptance of LGBT plus people. Then along came the election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in 1983. And she began very quickly in succession 2 campaigns, a family values campaign and a return to Victorian values campaign, neither of which had any place for LGBT plus people. Then we had the AIDS pandemic, where gay and bisexual men were vilified and scapegoated as a threat to the public health, and where tabloid newspapers and right-wing politicians dubbed AIDS, quote, the gay plague. It led to a massive increase in homophobic violence, a big increase in the arrest of gay and bisexual men by the police, and just generally a very, very toxic atmosphere of hostility towards our community. It really felt that like we were under attack.
Yeah. It
was like we were the enemy within. And indeed, Margaret Thatcher in 1987 at the Tory Party conference openly and publicly attacked the right to be gay. I mean, it was absolutely shocking. You know, we felt a beleaguered community, and it was so difficult to fight back because, of course, so many people in the LGBT plus community had switched away from LGBT plus activism towards AIDS activism, and in particular to AIDS support services, help and funding for organizations like the Terence Higgins Trust, the then main HIV organization in Britain. So we didn't really have the activist base initially to deal with all of these fightbacks. And of course, the culmination was in 1988 with the legislation of Section 28, the first new anti-gay law in Britain for a century.
Yeah, tell me about that. What was Section 28?
It was an amendment to the Local Government Act, which prohibited local authorities, i.e. local councils and local health and education authorities, from doing anything that could be construed as, quote, promoting homosexuality. And it was interpreted to mean anything positive, anything supportive at all. So it meant that schools refused point blank, in most cases, to offer any kind of support or counseling or affirmation for LGBT plus pupils. Homophobia was not challenged in the classroom. It meant that local run facilities were withdrawn. So local teenage groups for LGBT plus kids were no longer allowed to meet on council premises like libraries or meeting halls. The funding was pulled from organizations representing our community. And indeed, you know, even quite extraordinary things, you know, locally run art centers pulled gay-themed art exhibitions and gay-themed plays and films.
Yeah. So it's right across society then, it wasn't just in schools.
No, it was much broader.
Yeah.
And of course, local health authorities wouldn't do anything to support, local health authorities would do very little, if anything, to support gay and bisexual men in the midst of the AIDS crisis for fear that they could be construed as promoting homosexuality.
Yeah. And we've seen a return to this in Europe at the moment, in Poland and Hungary. And obviously Russia's a famous example, isn't it? But we'll talk about Russia just in a minute. Do you think we're seeing any backsliding in kind of the West on LGBTQI plus issues? I mean, I know we've gone a long way since then in this country and probably elsewhere in the West. And we can talk about globally, but do you think it's scary seeing Hungary and Poland and Russia with these kind of Section 28-like laws coming in at the moment?
Well, yes, of course it's scary. And also it's outrageous to think that Britain pioneered this kind of legislation. That's where they got the idea from. They borrowed it from Margaret Thatcher's government.
All right.
That's the toxic legacy that we have bequeathed to these countries.
Yeah.
Here in Britain, I wouldn't say there's a backward slide, but there is definitely a stalling. So, for example, the government promised to outlaw LGBT plus conversion therapy 3 years ago.
That's true, yeah.
And it still hasn't happened.
No.
It promised to reform the Gender Recognition Act, and indeed the overwhelming majority of people who corresponded to the government's consultation supported reform, but that's been kicked into the long grass. So right now, the real frontline issues are conversion therapy and trans rights.
Yeah.
And we've seen an incredibly toxic atmosphere here in Britain among large sections of the broadcast and print media and among right-wing politicians. Trans people are deemed to be fair game. They're being vilified, demonized, and scapegoated in just the same way as gay and bisexual men were 30 years ago.
That's interesting, because I have a gay friend and I put this to him and said, do you see any parallels between how the trans community are treated today with how the homosexual community were treated 20, 30 years ago? And he said, no, it's totally different. They're totally separate spheres. It's not really the same. So, but you're saying that it's very, very similar.
It is. There's very similar parallels. I mean, the kind of hate, misrepresentation, distortion, demonization, it's got very strong echoes.
Yeah.
And of course, trans people are different from trans people are different from LGBT people, but nonetheless, we share a common experience of prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime, and that's why we should stand together.
Yeah.
We also, of course, are gender non-conformists. LGBT people and trans people, neither of us conform to the way traditionally men and women are supposed to behave, and that gives us a common interest.
Yeah, of course. I want to move on now to Outrage. Who were Outrage? You were part of Outrage, and talk to me about how they were different to Stonewall, because you had two in the documentary. Kind of Stonewall is sort of depicted as kind of like a bit more moderate and rules orientated, whereas Outrage are a bit more kind of I guess grassroots and sort of witty and a little bit more outside of the rules. So talk to me about the two different organizations and why you ended up becoming a central figure in Outrage.
Well, Stonewall was essentially a parliamentary lobbying group. Its focus was almost exclusively, back then anyway, on law reform.
Okay.
It saw law reform as the key.
Yeah.
And of course, Outrage saw law reform as important, but not the only front.
Okay.
We also, in the tradition of the Gay Liberation Front, sought to change the culture, to change hearts and minds, to change the way in which institutions operated independently of the law. We also, I think, had a different sort of model or style of doing things. Stonewall was often referred to as LGBT plus people in suits. Yeah. Outrage was very much a direct action group, committed to non-violence and, where necessary, civil disobedience, law breaking, in order to highlight injustices. Many of us very explicitly mold ourselves on the Black Civil Rights Movement in America or the suffragettes here in Britain. Yeah, we saw a vital role being protest, to shake up the establishment, to do bizarre, daring, challenging, confrontational protests that would get news coverage, and through that news coverage raise public awareness about the scale of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic discrimination, and also, of course, put the authorities under pressure to change. We understood very clearly that you can do things behind closed doors, but that's all in private. No one knows about it. When you lobby an MP or government minister, it isn't on public view. It isn't recorded. It's a private thing, which has its place, but it's very limited.
Yeah.
And of course, governments tend to respond most when their bad actions are highlighted through the media.
Yeah.
They don't want bad publicity.
No.
So outrage exploited that.
So
the big difference is Stonewall was really just committed to equal rights within the status quo. It basically accepted society as it is, but simply wanted equal rights for LGBT plus people within that society.
Okay.
Whereas outrage was much more critical and discerning. We had a skeptical view towards mainstream social institutions. They were not made by or for us, and to simply seek equality within what existed would be collusion with an unjust system, and it would also effectively be our assimilation into straight society. We affirmed in outrage the importance of acknowledging and defending our own culture and history, of making our own demands based on what we needed, not on what straight laws currently existed.
And actually, this brings us on neatly to the next question or two, which is about the sort of the controversies that the documentary covers. One of which, probably the most prominent, is the outing, the forcible outing of prominent people, many in the clergy. I guess the question I have, I was watching it, even I couldn't really make my mind up whether the ends justified the means here. In the documentary, there are people who kind of throw various criticisms at you. Was it moral? Do you stand by what you did?
Oh, absolutely. My biggest regret and my biggest apology is that we didn't do outing earlier and target more homophobes and hypocrites.
Okay.
That would have changed the whole framework of the debate much sooner and got law reform much faster.
Did you see them as collateral? Did you care?
No, they were not collateral. This is a very carefully worked out moral, ethical tactic. We did not out anyone because they were in the closet. We only targeted public figures who were abusing their power and influence to harm the LGBT plus community, such as MPs who voted against LGBT plus equality, or church leaders and others who spoke out against equality and in favor of discrimination. So it was highlighting the contradiction between what these people said in public, being vocal critics of LGBT plus people and, defending straight family values, while at the same time hypocritically having same-sex relationships. So it was very much about targeting their two-facedness, their double standards.
Yeah.
And it was, for us, ethical self-defense of the queer community. We were defending our community against those who were doing us harm. And of the limited number of people who were outed, as far as I recall, none of them, after being outed, ever again said anything against our community, ever voted against our community, ever colluded with institutions persecuting us. It made them sit up, take fright, and stop their persecution.
So it was effective as well.
It was effective, yeah. And it was effective. Outing was effective in ways in which no other tactic was.
Okay.
For the critics of outing, they would have happily let these bigots continue on persecuting us. That would not have been an ethical decision.
Yeah.
Moreover, what I find so shocking is many of our critics, they laud the suffragettes who used violence, which we never did. They laud Nelson Mandela, who was spearheading a violent organization to overthrow apartheid by armed struggle, which we never did. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in the way in which we are being singled out, outrage is being singled out for criticism over this issue.
Do you think, this is something, because I'm a humanist as well, and I've sat on various faith councils and things, and I find that if you if you're deemed to be attacking something that's really sacrosanct, like religion, there's a deeper moral outrage among people in the UK. Do you think the fact that you went after the clergy, you went after the Church of England, you went after the Archbishop of Canterbury, this is an area which traditionally was off bounds really for criticism and for sort of radical campaigning. Do you think the fact that you went after them and their kind of position in our society as being kind of off limits, do you think that's one of the reasons why you got such bad press and you were attacked so much?
I'm sure it is, because a lot of people think the clergy are harmless.
Yeah.
They're not. Within the church, many LGBT plus people have either attempted or committed suicide because of the church's homophobic teachings.
Yeah.
I know people who killed themselves because their church told them that they were immoral, sinful, unnatural, abnormal, and that they were going to burn in hell.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit back and allow the church or anyone else get away with doing that, creating that atmosphere where young LGBT plus people end up killing themselves. We've got to take a stand, and religion should not be above criticism. In fact, since it upholds high moral standards, it should be held to an even higher moral standard. And as we all know, in the recorded teachings of Jesus Christ, discrimination is not a Christian value.
I mean, I've always believed in the idea that no belief is above criticism and no person is below dignity. I think that's a kind of a motto that always sticks in my head. I want to move on to the attempted arrest of Robert Mugabe, because it's quite comical in some ways, because it seems so audacious, and you've got to be, I guess, quite bold to come up with an idea of a citizen's arrest on a world leader. Talk to me about why you decided to do this, and whether or not you think actually the two attempts, was it two attempts you had, were effective as a means of kind of shining a light on what was happening there?
Well, I was approached by human rights defenders inside Zimbabwe who pleaded with me to do something to try and highlight the human rights abuses within their country by the Mugabe regime. This was at a time when mostly the terrible things that were happening in Zimbabwe were not being reported in Western countries, or indeed any countries, and when there was no international call for any sanctions or travel bans against the Zimbabwean leaders. Now, in these circumstances, I thought, well, I've got to do something dramatic to get attention, to shine a spotlight on the crimes of the Mugabe regime. If I simply hold a protest outside Zimbabwe House in London, that isn't going to get any attention. So I hit on the idea of using the power of citizen's arrest in conjunction with the British and international laws against torture, which mean that any state official who commits, condones, authorizes, or acquiesces in acts of torture anywhere in the world can be put on trial in any of the 130 plus signatory countries to the United Nations Convention Against Torture.
Yeah.
So the big issue was how and when. And so the first attempt was the result of a late night tip-off that President Mugabe was in London, this is 1999, on a private Christmas shopping trip to Harrods. And so myself and 3 members of Outrage ambushed his motorcade outside his hotel near Victoria Station. We did so on charges of torture. I mean, Mugabe is homophobic, but that was not the issue on which we were seeking his arrest.
Yeah.
It was on the charge of torture, that he had authorized and colluded with the torture of 2 Black journalists, Ray Choto and Mark Chabanduka, in the Zimbabwean capital, Harare. So we had an absolutely cast iron legal case. But unfortunately, when we ambushed his motorcade, running in front of it, forcing it to halt, then one of us ran behind the car so it couldn't go forward and couldn't go backward. I ran from the left-hand side and unlocked opened the unlocked rear car door. I was so surprised it wasn't locked, and reached in and then put Mugabe under arrest. You should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. His jaw dropped, his eyes popped. I think he thought he was going to be killed, but I was holding out my arms and hands to show that I didn't have a weapon. And so I said he was under arrest. We then summoned the police. They were gobsmacked. It was the president of Zimbabwe in the car, and we had him under arrest. But then they just ignored the legal case for his arrest under the Torture Convention and proceeded to arrest us. So we were sent off or dragged off to Belgravia police station, where we spent nearly 7 hours, while President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. The upshot of it was we did not succeed, but that arrest and the subsequent second arrest, which I attempted in Brussels 2 years later in 2001, made headlines all around the world.
Yeah.
And not just about the attempted arrest, but about the reason why we did it.
Yeah.
So it massively increased global public awareness about the terrible crimes against humanity by the Mugabe regime.
Yeah.
It shone a spotlight which enabled politicians and campaigners all across the world to rally to support the Zimbabwean people in their struggle for democracy and human rights. It also was a great psychological boost to people in Zimbabwe.
Right.
That they told me things like, we thought no one knew, we thought no one cared. And as a result of what I did with my outraged colleagues in London and by myself in Brussels 2 years later, lots of people knew and understood and felt in solidarity with the Zimbabweans.
1999, and then 2 years later, presumably at this stage, Mugabe is somebody who is still supported by the British state, because he was initially kind of a puppet almost. He was an ally of ours in Zimbabwe. By the time he died, he was very much deemed as a brutal dictator. So was it just the case that you got there before everybody else and everybody else needed to catch up? Or how did it come to be that it was so obvious to you, but so unobvious, if that's the right word, to everybody else? How were you so far ahead of public opinion and political opinion at this stage?
Well, I think that even many countries that did not support the Mugabe regime back in the 1990s preferred just to look the other way.
Okay. They knew, but they just didn't want to deal with it.
Yeah, or they claimed they didn't know, but I don't believe that.
Right.
That's why I had to do what I did, because I just felt that this silence, this inaction, this looking the other way had to be challenged, had to be exposed. We needed a light to be shone on what Mugabe was doing to his own Black people.
Yeah.
Mugabe in Matabeleland in the 1980s massacred up to 20,000 Black Africans who were supporters of the opposition leader, Joshua Nkomo. 20,000. That is the equivalent of a Sharpeville massacre every day for 9 months. Now, for those who don't know, Sharpeville was a horrendous massacre by the apartheid regime in South Africa in the 1960s. It has gone down in world history as one of the most ignominious human rights abuses of the modern era. But Mugabe, just 2 or so decades later, was doing something even worse, and nobody batted an eyelid. So that's why we had to act. Was it
the racism of low expectations, as in Black killing Black is not newsworthy because that's what Blacks are like, whereas whites killing Blacks or Blacks killing whites is newsworthy because whites are involved? Do you think there was that kind of racism of low expectations in the West?
I am certain that there was a subtle, unconscious, or maybe even conscious racism at play, that some people, or a lot of people thought, well, it's just Black people killing Black people, why should we care? That view is so disgusting.
Yeah.
It shows a lack of empathy, a lack of solidarity, a lack of awareness about what racism is.
I totally agree. I want to move on because we've still got quite a bit to talk about. Well, Russia 2018 World Cup. You, in the documentary, you spend a good sort of 10 minutes of the latter stage of the documentary, talking about or going through your journey from being in the UK, being approached by Russians who ask you to come and stand in solidarity with them in Moscow. So you go to Moscow, you protest there. The question I have for you is, in the documentary, it was really crucial that you went and gave these kind of confidential bits of paper to the media. Would you have done that had the media not shown up? Was it safe to do that? Is a big part of your campaigning reliant on the media's presence?
Well, absolutely. Going back to outrage, it's the same kind of philosophy. If you want to create change, you've got to make people aware of the injustice. And the most common and effective medium of raising public awareness is the media. News reports, radio and TV programs. This is the way in which you communicate to a wider audience about an injustice. And until people know about an injustice, they won't be mobilized to speak out against it. So using the media to shine a light on these abuses is absolutely critical for any successful campaign.
Yeah.
You look at the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. It was absolutely vital that TV crews and photographers were present when Martin Luther King and others staged their historic protests. It was only because of the media coverage that their heroism was revealed, and indeed the injustices they sought to overturn were made clear.
Yeah.
And that's what put pressure on the authorities to change.
Yeah.
Because, as always, the authorities who perpetrate injustice, they may be evil people and may do bad things, but they're very conscious about their reputation. They're very conscious about their public image.
Yeah.
And bad publicity is bad for them.
Yeah.
So they want to avoid it.
Yeah.
And, if bad publicity, for example, about what Putin was doing in Russia, and particularly what was happening to LGBT plus people in Chechnya, that bad publicity, which I helped generate when I staged the protest in the run-up to the World Cup in 2018, that was very, very effective. It hard to say whether it had any effect on the actions of the governments of Chechnya or Russia, but what we can say is that around that time, the reports of disappearances and torture seemed to dramatically reduce.
Right.
Now, that may or may not have had anything to do with that protest that I did. Probably not, in fact. But regardless, what was important is that through my protest, hundreds of millions of people around the world watching TV and reading newspapers learned about the anti-LGBT plus witch hunts in Chechnya.
I guess it must be really hard not to be able to quantify your impact, but just hopeful that it will filter through and there will be ripples, and later down the line, history will look back and see, okay, Peter did this, and then a certain amount of time later, there was this change, and maybe there's a correlation there. But do you ever feel like the fact that you can't quantify your impact is a difficult thing to stomach, or do you just hope that later down the line things will change as a result? Are you ever conscious of that kind of like inability to quantify what you do?
Well, I'm conscious that it's very difficult often to precisely quantify what the impact of a protest has been.
Yeah.
But I do know that the cumulative collective effort of many different protests and lobbying and letter writing campaigns, all taken together, they do produce change.
Yeah.
And which one precisely was the key factor? It's always hard to tell. But all throughout history, every progressive movement for social change has used protest and media events as a way of exposing tyranny and injustice.
Yeah. And
undoubtedly, it has had some impact and success.
Yeah. What's been the reception of the documentary?
A lot of people have said, hey, I never knew you've been campaigning for so long, or I never knew you campaign on so many different issues.
Yeah.
And in the documentary, the number of issues touched upon is actually quite small.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been involved in literally thousands of different campaigns over the last 54 years. And I think about a dozen or so are featured in the film. So it is just a snapshot of many decades of diverse campaigning.
I guess I was going to ask you this question earlier, but I think I read an article where you said it was a shame you didn't get an interview with Mike Tyson, because that would have really added an extra dimension to the documentary. Just very, very quickly, just what was the whole thing with Mike Tyson? Because you went and spoke to him and you challenged him on his homophobic views, and he changed his views as a result of that conversation, no?
Yeah, this was in the run-up to his world title fight. Mike Tyson's world title fight against the British boxer Lennox Lewis, which was held in Memphis, Tennessee. I heard about that title fight and had also heard numerous examples of Mike Tyson's homophobic epithets against Lewis and indeed against other boxers previously. I thought someone's got to call out this guy over his homophobia. So I traveled to Memphis. When I arrived, I knew that Mike Tyson would be staying somewhere in the vicinity of Memphis. And by chance, I read a newspaper report which mentioned the suburb in which he was staying. Then I worked out he'd have to train in the days leading up to the title fight. So he'd have to go to a gym. So I did a search and found the gyms in the area. And there were some really like dinky winky ones, but there was one that really stood out as being a world-class professional gym. And I thought, my hunch is that's where he'll go training. So on a Sunday morning, I turned up there with 2 local Memphis LGBT activists, and we confronted him as he got out of his SUV to go into the gym. And I challenged him over his homophobia. He initially raised his fist as though he was going to clock me.
My God.
But then saw all the TV cameras and journalists and sort of, relaxed a bit, but very strongly protested that he wasn't homophobic. And I said, well, why do you say those homophobic slurs? And he said, well, it's just to wind guys up. And I said, well, look, you wouldn't like it if a white boxer used racist language to wind you up. And he's sort of like ummed and ahed and sort of conceded that point. So then I said to him, look, if you're not homophobic, will you make a statement in support of LGBT plus rights? And so he did. He made a statement saying he opposed discrimination against LGBT plus people. Now, I think at the time, he was probably the first or one of the first big macho straight superstars to have ever done that.
Yeah.
So it's a great story of redemption, how he changed when challenged.
Yeah. And also a great story on your part about, courage. And, Mike Tyson's a fairly scary guy. He bit someone's ear off, in the ring, for goodness sake. But I guess, though, if you're going to the Kremlin and doing these things, then Mike Tyson might not be such a scary prospect after all. I don't know. But no, that's fantastic. And Mike Tyson is the sort of person with the kind of base that I guess you kind of want to reach as well, isn't he? Like he had so much influence back then. I think of someone like Anthony Joshua today. The reason why he's such a massive corporate star for the corporate industry is because he reaches certain communities as well, which politicians can't reach and campaigners can't reach. So I can see why that must have been such a massive thing. Final 2 questions. Has the world caught up with Peter Tatchell? Because in the documentary, it kind of says I think it's Ian McKellen who says you've just been proven right time after time after time. And it's actually been the world that's been catching up with you. Where do you see us now? Have we caught up to where we need to be, Peter, with you yet?
Well, certainly my views, values, and methods have not changed much in the last 5 decades. And it's great to see the way in which Britain and the world, or parts of the world, have changed. Still, there are 70 countries and jurisdictions that criminalize same-sex relations. 11 have the death penalty. But even within these countries, there are movements and change, often covert and secretive. But with the internet and social media, it's impossible for tyrannies to block out the message of LGBT plus liberation. So I'm incredibly happy and proud that change has come, and it is coming and will continue to come, although we still have a long way to go on the global stage.
Yeah. So final question, what are you currently working on, and what's the future for Peter Tatchell? Will we be seeing you for decades longer?
Well, I'm 69 now. I hope to continue health willing for another 26 years or so. Maybe retirement about 95 might be appropriate. I'm not sure. But I think I will be a campaigner at heart until the day I die.
Yeah.
And there are so many campaigns to fight and win. You know, still we have to defend the trans communities in Britain and around the world. Still we have to fight to end LGBT plus conversion therapy. Still we've got a battle here in Britain to secure an end to the detention and deportation of LGBT plus refugees and asylum seekers. There are so many battles still to fight, and I'm game to keep going and fight them.
Well, Peter, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say thanks so much for everything you do. Your documentary for me was really inspiring. Anyone who's listened to this who hasn't yet seen it, it's on Netflix. Go and watch it. Are there any other platforms where it's available, or is it just Netflix?
No,
just Netflix.
Just Netflix. Just
Netflix. Cool. And good luck with all of your future campaigning. We can follow the Peter Tatchell Foundation, can't we, on social media?
Yeah, well, you can follow me personally at Peter Tatchell.
Yep.
If you go on my foundation's website, which is www.petertatchellfoundation.org, you'll see a resume of all the different campaigns and activities we're doing. In the top right-hand corner, there's a button which says Join Us. If you click on that and give us your email address, we will send you a weekly bulletin about a range of LGBT plus and other human rights issues.
Great. Most
of them serious, but we usually have a funny or quirky one as well. Yeah. And it's totally free. There's no charge. So please sign up and become part of our little LGBT plus and human rights community. I will be doing that as soon as we end this call. Peter Tatchell, thank you very much. I'll finish with my motto, which hopefully will encourage and motivate your viewers. Don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Love it. Yeah, that's the campaigning spirit, isn't it? That's the fire. You've got to have that. Peter, thank you. Thank you.